The first time Cale Mercer died, he was 17 years old. Not literally, of course. His heart continued its mechanical rhythm, his lungs drew breath without permission, and his blood circulated through vessels that had never known the violence of true cessation. But something inside him, the trembling, cowering thing that had governed his existence since childhood, finally stopped breathing on the rain-soaked streets of New Detroit, in the shadow of the Galactic Embassy where humanity's representatives conducted their careful negotiations with the wider universe. He remembered the moment with the crystalline clarity that trauma often leaves behind. The Vorthani delegate, 7 feet of obsidian carapace and clicking mandibles, had emerged from the embassy's towering doors, surrounded by human security personnel who kept their hands conspicuously away from their weapons. The crowd that had gathered parted like water before a stone, fear rippling through them in visible waves. But not Cale. Cale had stood frozen, directly in the delegate's path, because his legs had simply refused to obey his screaming brain's commands to move. His body had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible, locking him in place while his mind dissolved into pure, primal terror. The Vorthani had stopped before him. Those compound eyes, each facet reflecting Cale's pale, sweat-streaked face, had regarded him with something that might have been curiosity or contempt, or perhaps nothing at all, since human understanding of Vorthani expressions remained rudimentary at best. "This one does not flee," the delegate had observed, its voice emerging from a translator unit mounted on its thorax. "Unusual for your species." Cale had wanted to explain that he wasn't brave, that he was simply broken, that his fear had grown so overwhelming it had circled back around to paralysis. But his throat had closed around the words, leaving him mute and trembling. The delegate's security detail had gently but firmly moved him aside, and the moment had passed. But, as Cale had stood there, watching the Vorthani procession disappear into their waiting transport, something had shifted in his chest. A question had formed, burning like a coal in the darkness of his fear: what if I could choose differently? That night, alone in his cramped apartment overlooking the city's industrial district, Cale had begun the slow, agonizing process of killing the weak thing inside himself. 10 years later, Cale Mercer was unrecognizable. Not in appearance, he still wore the same unremarkable face, the same medium height and medium build that had always allowed him to disappear into crowds. His brown hair had perhaps a few more streaks of gray at the temples, and his eyes had developed the particular emptiness of someone who had stared into their own abyss and emerged carrying pieces of it. But these were minor changes, cosmetic alterations to a vessel that had been entirely rebuilt from within. The transformation had not been quick, and it had not been painless. Cale had spent years dismantling himself, piece by piece, examining every fear and every weakness with the clinical detachment of a surgeon operating on their own body. He had studied the mechanisms of terror, traced them back to their evolutionary roots, and then systematically excised them from his consciousness. This did not make him fearless. He had learned that fearlessness was simply another form of stupidity. Instead, he had learned to feel fear without being controlled by it. He had built a wall between the sensation and the response, a barrier constructed from thousands of small victories over his own instincts. He had started with the minor terrors: public speaking, social rejection, the judgment of strangers. He had forced himself into uncomfortable situations again and again, enduring the spike of anxiety until it became familiar, then manageable, then almost irrelevant. He had spoken in front of crowds until the trembling stopped. He had approached strangers until the fear of rejection became merely an intellectual concept rather than a visceral threat. Then, he had moved on to the physical fears. Heights, confined spaces, darkness, pain. He had climbed mountains and descended into caves. He had sat in perfect darkness for hours, confronting the formless terrors that lurked in the absence of light. He had trained his body to accept pain as information rather than alarm, useful data about damage rather than a command to flee. And, finally, he had confronted the deepest fear of all, death itself. This had required years of meditation, of philosophical examination, of careful psychological reconstruction. He had not eliminated his survival instinct, that would have been suicidal. But he had learned to face the concept of his own mortality without flinching, to accept that his existence was temporary and that this temporariness did not diminish its value. By the time he finished, Cale Mercer had become something rare in human society, a man who had systematically destroyed his weaker self and emerged from the wreckage as something harder, cleaner, more capable. He was not a superhuman. He possessed no genetic modifications, no neural implants, no cybernetic enhancements. He was simply a human being who had taken full ownership of his own psychology. This made him valuable in ways he had never anticipated. The Galactic Council had existed for 300,000 years before humanity's first radio signals reached alien receivers. It comprised over 400 spacefaring species, each with their own histories, cultures, and capabilities. Humanity had been invited to join as a provisional member only 40 years ago, after first contact had nearly resulted in mutual annihilation between Earth's panicked militaries and a consortium survey vessel that had wandered too close to Mars. Humanity's position in the Council remained precarious. They were newcomers to a political landscape that had been established before their ancestors had mastered fire. Their technology, while rapidly advancing, remained centuries behind the galactic standard. Their population was concentrated on a single planet and a handful of fragile colonies. And their psychology, the psychology that Cale had spent a decade studying and reshaping, was considered dangerously unstable by most galactic standards. Most species in the Council had evolved past certain emotional responses that humans still carried. The Vorthani, for instance, had eliminated fear through genetic engineering millennia ago. They made decisions based on pure calculation, unburdened by the weight of terror. The Luminari existed as beings of pure energy who had transcended physical vulnerability entirely. The consortium's silicon-based minds processed threat assessment without the hormonal cascade that plagued organic beings. Humans, by contrast, were awash in fear. They feared death, pain, loss, rejection, failure, the unknown, the dark, heights, depths, spiders, snakes, open spaces, enclosed spaces, and countless other stimuli that most galactic species had engineered away. This fear made them unpredictable. It made them irrational. And it made them dangerous not because they were powerful, but because fear-driven decisions could be catastrophic in ways that logic-driven decisions could not. The Council tolerated humanity because they were useful in specific contexts. Their fear responses, properly channeled, made them excellent emergency personnel. Their survival instincts drove innovations in defensive technology. And their cultural obsession with overcoming fear had produced individuals like Cale, psychological anomalies who could navigate situations that would drive other species to catatonia or violence. It was this last category that brought Ambassador Elena Vasquez to Cale's door on a rain-streaked evening 3 months after his 27th birthday. "You have an unusual reputation, Mr. Mercer." Cale studied the woman across his small kitchen table. Elena Vasquez had the polished appearance of a career diplomat, silver hair swept back in an elegant knot, eyes sharp with intelligence, clothing expensive but understated. She was also clearly exhausted, with shadows under her eyes and a tension in her shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible pressures. "I wasn't aware I had any reputation at all," Cale replied, pouring her a cup of tea that she had declined 3 times before finally accepting. "You're a licensed fear consultant. You've worked with corporations preparing executives for hostile negotiations, military units deploying to high-stress environments, and, most interestingly, 3 separate first contact teams. The work with the first contact teams was classified. I have high clearance." Elena accepted the tea but didn't drink it. The Selenari contact, in particular. A species that communicates exclusively through emotional projection. Every other human in the room collapsed into panic within 30 seconds. You maintained productive communication for 6 hours. Cale remembered that day. The Selenari had been curious about humans, and their curiosity had manifested as a constant psychic pressure, an alien attention that human minds interpreted as overwhelming threat. The other team members had devolved into screaming, crying, or catatonic withdrawal. Cale had sat in the center of the room, feeling the fear wash through him like waves through water, acknowledging its presence without allowing it to control his actions. "I learned to manage my responses," he said simply. "It's a skill like any other. It's not a skill like any other. It's a skill that fewer than 1% of humans can master, and you've developed it to an unprecedented degree." Elena finally took a sip of her tea, grimacing slightly at the temperature. Which is why I'm here with a proposition that may determine the future of humanity's position in the Galactic Council. Kale waited. He had learned that silence was often more effective than questions. Are you familiar with the Cathari? The name triggered a cascade of memories, newscasts about diplomatic incidents, classified briefings from his first contact work, hushed conversations in the corridors of the Galactic Embassy. The Cathari were one of the Council's oldest species, ancient when humanity's ancestors were still learning to walk upright. They were also one of the most powerful, their technology and influence extending across thousands of star systems. But the Cathari were also isolated. They had withdrawn from most galactic affairs centuries ago, emerging only for matters of extreme importance. Their homeworld was closed to visitors. Their representatives rarely appeared in council chambers. And their psychology was considered utterly incomprehensible, even by galactic standards. I know what everyone knows, Kale said. They're old, powerful, and enigmatic. They've also made a request of humanity. A specific request, for a specific individual. Elena set down her teacup with careful precision. They want you, Mr. Mercer. The Cathari ship arrived in Earth orbit 3 days later. Kale had spent those 3 days in intensive briefings, absorbing every scrap of information humanity had accumulated about the Cathari over 40 years of council membership. The sum total of that information was distressingly small. The Cathari were bipedal, roughly humanoid in shape, with smooth gray skin and large eyes adapted for low-light environments. They communicated through a combination of speech and pheromonal signals that human translators could only partially interpret. Their technology was biological rather than mechanical, grown rather than built, and their ships were living organisms that they cultivated over centuries. Beyond these basic facts, almost nothing was certain. The Cathari did not explain their motivations. They did not participate in cultural exchanges. They did not share their history, their values, or their goals. They simply existed, ancient and inscrutable, occasionally intervening in galactic affairs with decisive force before retreating again into their self-imposed isolation. And now they wanted Kale. He stood in the observation lounge of the Galactic Embassy's orbital station, watching the Cathari ship approach. It was beautiful in a way that defied description, a flowing, organic shape that seemed to shift and breathe as it moved through space. The station's sensors reported that it was technically alive, a creature vast enough to swallow the embassy station whole, its hull composed of something that was neither metal nor flesh but some intermediate substance that human science could not categorize. Nervous? Kale turned to find Elena Vasquez standing beside him. She had exchanged her diplomatic attire for something more practical, a jumpsuit bearing the insignia of the Human Expeditionary Corps, the organization responsible for humanity's interactions with the wider galaxy. Yes, he admitted. Fear is an appropriate response to genuine uncertainty. Elena smiled slightly. Most people in your position would pretend otherwise. Most people in my position haven't spent 10 years learning that acknowledging fear is the first step to managing it. Kale returned his attention to the approaching ship. Do we know anything about why they want me specifically? You mentioned their request was unusual. The Cathari delegate who made the request said only that they had observed your work with the Selenari and found it. Elena paused, consulting a small datapad. Indicative of valuable potential. We asked for clarification. They declined to provide it. That's not reassuring. Nothing about the Cathari is reassuring. They've existed since before the Council was formed. They've watched civilizations rise and fall, seen species evolve and go extinct, witnessed events that would shatter human comprehension. And, in all that time, they've never once made a direct request to humanity. Elena touched his arm, a surprisingly human gesture. Whatever they want from you, Mr. Mercer, it matters. It matters to them, and it should matter to us. The Cathari ship settled into a docking position, tendrils extending from its hull to interface with the station's airlocks. Kale felt the vibration through the floor as biological and mechanical systems achieved an uneasy harmony. I suppose I should go find out what they want, he said. The interior of the Cathari ship was nothing like Kale had expected. He had anticipated something alien, strange geometries, incomprehensible interfaces, environments hostile to human physiology. Instead, he found himself walking through corridors that felt almost familiar. The walls curved in gentle arcs, lined with a bioluminescent material that provided soft, comfortable light. The air was warm and humid, rich with organic scents that were strange but not unpleasant. The floor yielded slightly under his feet, absorbing the impact of each step. It was only when he paid closer attention that the alienness became apparent. The walls breathed subtle expansions and contractions that corresponded to no visible respiratory system. The light sources were not technological but biological, clusters of organisms embedded in the wall tissue that reacted to his presence, brightening as he approached and dimming as he passed. And the corridor itself seemed to be guiding him, subtle changes in the floor's texture directing his steps toward some destination that he could not yet perceive. His escort, a Cathari who had introduced themselves only as guide, walked beside him in silence. Guide was smaller than Kale had expected, perhaps 5 feet tall, with the characteristic gray skin and large dark eyes of their species. They wore no clothing or equipment, their body apparently sufficient for all necessary functions. "The ship is curious about you," Guide said eventually. Their voice emerged from a translator pendant around Kale's neck, the original sounds being something that human ears could not properly process. "The ship is conscious?" "Conscious is perhaps not the correct term. The ship is alive. It perceives. It responds. Whether this constitutes consciousness by your species' definitions is a philosophical question that we have debated for longer than your species has existed." Guide's large eyes turned toward Kale, reflecting the bioluminescent glow. "You are not afraid." "I am afraid," Kale corrected. "I have simply learned not to let fear dictate my actions." Guide stopped walking. The corridor around them seemed to pause as well, the breathing walls holding their expansion, the light sources fixing their luminosity. "Explain," Guide said. Kale considered the request. In his experience, most species found human fear responses either disgusting or fascinating, but few understood them. The Cathari's ancient existence suggested they had long since moved past such primitive responses, which made their current interest particularly intriguing. "Fear is a survival mechanism," he began. "It evolved to protect our ancestors from threats in their environment. When a human perceives danger, their body responds automatically, increased heart rate, heightened awareness, preparation for fight or flight. This response was useful when the threats were simple predators, falls, hostile tribes. But, in complex social environments, automatic fear responses often cause more problems than they solve." "So you removed them?" "No. Removing fear entirely would be suicidal. It would eliminate an important source of information about potential threats. Instead, I learned to create a separation between the fear response and my decision-making process. I feel fear, but I don't have to act on it. I can acknowledge it, examine it, and choose my response based on rational assessment rather than instinct." Guide remained still for a long moment. Around them, the ship seemed to be waiting, its biological processes suspended in what Kale could only interpret as attention. "This is why you were requested," Guide said finally. "Come. The council awaits." The council chamber was located at the heart of the Cathari ship, a vast spherical space that seemed to exist in defiance of the vessel's external dimensions. Kale estimated the chamber at least half a kilometer in diameter, filled with a soft golden light that emanated from everywhere and nowhere. In the center, floating in apparent defiance of gravity, was a platform surrounded by thousands of Cathari. They did not sit in ranks or rows, but instead occupied three-dimensional space, their bodies oriented in seemingly random directions that somehow resolved into a coherent pattern when viewed as a whole. Their eyes, thousands of dark, gleaming surfaces, all turned toward Kale as he entered. The pressure of that attention was immense. Kale felt his heart rate spike, his palms grow slick, his vision narrow as his body screamed warnings about being surrounded by potential threats. He acknowledged the fear, examined its sources, and set it aside like a familiar garment that no longer fit. "Human," a voice spoke. It was not one voice but thousands, harmonized into a single utterance that resonated through the chamber and through Kale's bones. "You have been observed. You have been evaluated. You have been chosen. Chosen for what? Kale asked. His voice sounded thin in the vastness of the chamber, but he kept it steady. To bear witness. To carry a burden. To answer a question that has haunted our species for longer than your world has orbited its star. The Cathari shifted, their bodies moving in waves that suggested communication in frequencies Kale could not perceive. Then, from the center of the mass, a single figure descended toward the platform. It was taller than Guide, perhaps 7 feet, with features that were subtly different from the others Kale had seen, more angular, more pronounced, as if carved rather than grown. I am called Elder in your tongue, the figure said, its voice carrying without the need for a translator. I speak for those who remember the beginning, and for those who fear the end. Fear? The word surprised Kale. I was told the Cathari had evolved past fear. No species evolves past fear, Elder replied. Some suppress it. Some redirect it. Some externalize it into systems and structures that allow them to ignore its presence. But fear remains, always, at the root of consciousness. To be aware is to know that awareness can end. And to know that awareness can end is to fear. The Elder descended further, coming to rest on the platform directly before Kale. Up close, Kale could see the texture of their skin, not smooth as it appeared from a distance, but covered in fine patterns that might have been writing or circuitry or something else entirely. The Cathari do not fear death, Elder continued. We have lived so long that individual death has lost its sting. We do not fear pain. We have learned to modulate our sensory inputs until pain becomes simply information. We do not fear loss. We have lost so much over the millennia that loss has become the expected state of existence. Then, what do you fear? The question hung in the golden light. Around them, the thousands of Cathari had gone utterly still, their attention focused with an intensity that Kale could feel like physical pressure. We fear, Elder said slowly, that we have forgotten how to change.